Running parallel to the Manosphere is a booming market driven by Tradwife and stay-at-home girlfriend content. Influencers glamorize submission and rigid gender roles through carefully staged domestic scenes, often detached from economic reality. It shares the playbook with the Manosphere, algorithms rewarding fantasy over truth, like what we see here, while reshaping expectations of femininity just as aggressively as the masculinity sold to men. So, to understand the real-world impact of this content and why this kind of outdated ideology is seemingly making a comeback, we welcome Jess Reia, faculty co-lead at the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia, who is also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. And from Melbourne, we welcome Stephen Roberts, professor of sociology at Monash University. Now, Jess, I'm going to start with you and just ask you why this kind of content is being consumed at such scale, and who is it that is consuming this kind of content?
There's context is very important when we analyze this problem. But thinking from the US perspective, there's this desire to return to tradition, including very traditional gender roles. And in our research, we are looking specifically at gender identity and expression. And we see how misogyny and transmisogyny are intertwined in these spaces. And it's also reacting to more deeper social issues that we have in the United States, like a pushback against harms collectively. It is rooted in this American individualist culture that we see, and a lack of support networks, public services, and this ideal of a woman that can perform these family roles and take care of the kids and stay at home, that are not necessarily feasible or viable for the majority of the population of the country, that live kind of vicariously through these profiles that are there and spreading this kind of lifestyle that's not necessarily possible. And some of these people are influencers, they monetize the content, it's an industry and they are making a living out of that as well.
Stephen, from a sociological perspective, what is really new and different from today's online gender representation from earlier forms of sexism?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's coming from both sides, right? I think the Tradwife thing obviously really is a sexist trope as well, this kind of return to a particular type of gender relations. And that's what captures the whole thing. So this kind of desperation on some level to signal that a return to traditional values, a traditional gender binary logic, will resolve the contemporary problems that young people, particularly young people, are facing. So part of the another reflection on the Tradwife movement is that there's this idea that it celebrates and rejects the neoliberal kind of hustle culture that we're all encouraged to do. So it's almost like a freeing, when actually what's interesting about this, and I think part of today's online misogyny, is it presents it kind of subverts the logic, and women's freedom, especially economic empowerment, is cast as being a problem. So it's a kind of both subtle form of misogyny in that way, that it kind of is encouraging young women to go back to the kitchen, as it were, and stay at home. But then these more overt forms of misogyny that have scale, and from men's lips and men's actions and behaviors in the Manosphere, they have scale, they have speed, they have persistence. So one of the things, going back to my own research again, is that what teachers have noticed is an amplification of this kind of reanimated version of misogyny. So sometimes we refer to this in some of the literature as the new misogyny. So that's, not discarding the fact that misogyny is a through line that we see through many of our societies globally, but the way it's been amplified in an unapologetic and unabashed kind of male supremacist logic seems to be much more in your face, and it travels through these different mechanisms, through memes, but through self-help and through wellness and through advice around advice around the economy and so on. But the point really is that it's more volatile and more violent and more entitled.
And there's even another just a sinister undertone, and that's its linkage to the far right movement. Jess, you brought up the rejection of non-binary and other ideas that allow people space and freedom. Can you explain that link to the far right movement that you're seeing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, again, speaking from a US perspective, even though this is a global coordinated agenda, we see like similar processes in the UK, and we saw in South America, in Argentina, and Brazil, for example. But these attacks on trans rights are deeply connected to this movement of like trying to enforce very strict gender roles of like what woman should be, or the idea that gender is biological. And we saw that translated into policies in the United States, like the new AI regulation, for example, being called like anti-woke and mentioning terms that are slurs that the community, like the queer community, has been trying to avoid for a long, long time. So we see that connected to a very coordinated agenda in government and around government. And
can I just jump in there and say also there's really, really important points, and the extension of that, what that we see unfortunately is an overlap with broader right-wing talk points as well around migration, like being really, really central to this. So there's a really, even though Manosphere characters can appear to be from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, that one of the common threads is the kind of protection of the state that they're in from foreign invaders. So you often see this kind of alongside, and again, these things overlap so strongly. Anti-trans rhetoric almost always is a kind of mobilized narrative that is mobilized alongside anti-immigration positions, which also are kind of saturated with the same misogynistic logics of usually kind of communicated as protective, but certainly basically racist, and insinuating that the foreign invader is going to come and kind of take the purity of the white woman is the kind of typical narrative. So I just wanted to kind of stress really that these overlaps are really striking, and I think that's what makes it even more problematic when we think about misogyny and gendered violence in and of itself is terrible, and this might be the route that our young people are going down when they're exposed to that content, but the end game is actually even more pernicious as well.
Yeah, so really troubling that it goes well beyond the messaging of just keeping women back in the kitchen and at home. I mean, it has so many further implications. But before we continue, let's get the perspective of the younger generation. We spoke to Josh Sargent. He's a 16-year-old Gen Z commentator from the UK. He tells us how he feels about the digital world and the education system. Take a listen.
You know, there's a role model crisis, economic problems worldwide. The education system is alienating young boys, and the curriculum feels outdated and not useful. So, yeah, there's just a whole host of things, and a lot of solution can only come from sort of a policy angle and government. But in terms of what everyone in society can take part in, it's just being prepared to have open, honest conversation without sort of jumping into blaming or stigmatizing or telling off, but just opening up a dialogue and helping boys feel like they can talk. So I definitely want to see more conversations on male body image in the media. There's been, rightfully so, there's been a very big emphasis on female body image last 20, 30 years. If we could replicate that for male body image, which I feel goes very often undiscussed.
Just Josh there makes some very good points, but you know, as the technology advances, there's more and more troubling content out there. We've heard of schoolboys using generative AI to circulate deepfake sexual images of their classmates, using technology to present images perhaps previously they weren't able to do so easily and and spreading it so quickly. So I want to understand what kind of, from your point of view, what kind of education reform is urgently needed around digital literacy and the ethical use of these kinds of emerging technologies, especially AI. Jess?
Yes. Well, that's a great question. If you're thinking in terms of education, from my experience, because I teach current and future data science, so lots of computer scientists and engineers as well. And it's really like worrisome to see like the lack of this kind of like digital literacy and ethical discussion in our curriculum nationwide, with exceptions. And so like it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to make sure that the people developing these technologies, in my case, like in the case of the school where I work, that they know the social impact of what they're doing and the harms that what they're developing, all the AI models can cause on society. We see this pressure to adopt AI, sometimes in a really uncritical or unconcerned way. And this rush like doesn't allow us to have really meaningful conversations, including like, should we even be using certain technologies, or should technologies exist like the ones that can provide like so easily deep fakes and notification of people, and they are like widely available regardless of like age or context. So thinking about education in this more holistic, comprehensive way. And in my case, like higher education is very, very important that we, like as universities and scholars and people like working with different communities, can think about the real impacts of that and educate and like learn together as well is very, very important, because we do have so many organizations advocating like for better internet governance in general.
Now, Stephen, as I mentioned, when I was researching the show, it really drew me down some kind of a rabbit hole of the Manosphere, Tradwives, and all this negative messaging about women, and again, all the other things that you both mentioned that also leads to all the other undertones. So we're running out of time here, but before we go, what is the one positive thing you can see that is changing, or that you feel can stop this snowball effect that we're seeing, that is pushed by algorithms and perhaps those who are trying to just make a profit out of this negativity? Is there something that we can take comfort in, that we know that this isn't only the direction we're heading?
For me, I think what's really interesting and comforting is that there are large numbers of young people that already have very good media literacy. So what we're talking about often is a sort of hardcore cluster in classrooms, for example. So maybe 20 to 25% of the students engage with this content in quite a kind of and respond to this content in a way that brings the aggression and the misogyny into the classroom. So there's something very good and positive about where we're at already, but as a reminder that we need to do more. So it's not just platform and media literacy, but gender literacy, and kind of lifting up those models of boys who are showing how to both disengage, like the young man that you've been presenting on the video, but also models of masculinity that don't even engage in the first place, that are able to look beyond dominance, beyond wealth, beyond kind of notoriety. Our celebration should be of the young people that are doing this already, alongside an integration of good educational reform around kind of respectful relationships training when it's properly embedded and done properly. The evidence does tell us that young people's attitudes can shift. So I think on the one hand, there's young people who are very well skilled to do this work already. And on the other hand, we have good prospects for educational reform if it's properly implemented and can help with this challenge.